Hello everyone, I am happy to welcome you yet again to another session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism and Literature. Today's lecture is titled Feminism and Postmodernism, and this needs to be seen in continuation with our discussions of Marxism and postmodernism and how we illustrated how Marxism needs to be seen in radical opposition and as a contrast to how postmodernist theories work. And as a corollary to our understanding of Marxism and postmodernism, feminism and postmodernism has a more ambivalent relationship. There are occasions when they contradict each other, but it also exists as two kinds of complementary forces at work, both in different paradigms altogether. And we begin looking at the implications of postmodern feminism and what we understand by that. It would be appropriate to say that the inaugural moment of postmodern feminism could be located with the work of Judith Butler, and this is something we have already taken a look at in one of the earlier sessions. It's also a turning point from structuralism towards post-structuralism. It's marked by a linguistic turn, as we have already noted. And Judith Butler proposed the idea of performativity and a new theory of gender, arguing that gender needs to be seen as a discursive construction and a performance rather than a biological fact. And this sort of a concept also rejected the dualistic view of gender and also pointed towards the inseparability of the body from language and social norms. For example, when we talk about the woman as a linguistic construct, it needs to be kept in mind that the focus is on the becoming rather than the being. In that sense, one is not born a woman, but one becomes a woman. So this sort of play with the language aspects and how it interferes with the meaning making process has been one of the important objectives of Judith Butler's work. And this sort of an idea also rejects the assumption that all women share a common kind of oppression and that they could be clubbed together under a common kind of an identity. So in that sense, the postmodern feminism is also about challenging identitarian terms such as queer and transgender, and also about locating women away from all kinds of essentializing and universalizing ideas. There are certain very marked ways in which postmodern feminism departs or moves away from the existing kinds of feminist theories. The postmodern feminist approach criticized the preceding feminist theory for claiming false universality. And this was due to the use of categories such as white or Western or heterosexual or middle class, and the postmodern feminists began to argue that these sort of universalizing essentialist concepts cannot be used to talk about all women across the globe. And this also entailed that one cannot see women as a single homogeneous group, but should be attentive to the differences which are inherent within. So in that sense, the term difference could be located at the heart of all postmodern feminisms. Postmodern feminism also critiqued all preceding theories as being part of the essentialist masculinist enlightenment, comes closer to the postmodern ideas shared by a number of other theorists. And some of the major proponents of this postmodern post-structuralist feminism are Helen Sixu, Julia Kristeva, and Judith Butler. Postmodern feminism is concerned more with language discourses and the relationships between power and knowledge, and less about politics and opportunities. So how does it differ from, say, radical feminism or Marxist feminism or liberal feminism? Radical feminism operates with the assumption that at the heart of all kinds of oppression remains patriarchy, and the society is inherently patriarchal. Marxist feminism moves away a little bit from radical feminism and argues that it is not all about patriarchy, it is also about capitalism. And when we come to liberal feminism, it talks about gender as a limiting principle which could harm and which could delimit both men and women. It talks about giving equal opportunities to men and women. It also does not seek to revolutionize the system, but rather it prefers to work within the system and reform the systems in particular ways. In that sense, postmodern feminism is very different from radical feminism, Marxist feminism, or liberal feminism. So it's also important to delineate the distinction between feminism and feminist theory. Feminism needs to be seen as a stance, it's more like a political position. But feminist theory, on the other hand, is a philosophical and analytical approach that employs this political position to read cultural practices like art or literature. So when we talk about feminist theory, it's also drawing a link between the representations of women in art and the real material conditions in which they live. This understanding of the distinctions is very important, just like our understanding just like we understand the distinction between postmodernism and postmodernist theories. One of the most common ways in which feminism and postmodernism has been talked together as their representation as natural allies. So, Linda Nicholson, in her edited work Feminism and Postmodernism, published in 1990, she asked this pertinent question: is postmodernism a natural ally of feminism? And this is primarily due to its opposition to a normative masculinity which operates in league with the ideals of Enlightenment project. And this identification of a natural ally in each other, for feminism identifying an ally in postmodernism and for postmodernism identifying an ally in feminism, this has been seen as a most common form of rhetoric, the most common form of critique which could be used in this context. And there are certain definitive reasons for seeing postmodernism and feminism as complementary forces, because if we talk of feminist literary criticism, which is the direct product of the women's movements of the 1960s, we can see that those theorists and those writers, they realize the significance of the images of women and also realize that it is vital to combat them and question their authority. And the feminist literary critical practices were also defined against the traditional representation of women. In similar ways, postmodernity or postmodernism was also characterized by smaller and multiple narratives. They also questioned meta-narratives like patriarchy, capitalism, liberal humanism and Marxism. So at some level, both feminist theories and postmodernist theories were moving away from the grand narrative of the Enlightenment project and also identifying certain structures of oppression which were inherent to those Enlightenment project. And postmodernism moved away from the classical realist practices and also against the fierce asceticism of the 19th century works, and they also reacted against the absolute unitary conception of knowledge. So these two ideas in which feminist theory moves against the traditional representation of women and how postmodernist theories move against the absolute unitary conception of knowledge, they go together as complementary forces. Though they work in different paradigms, it's difficult not to notice some of the similarities with which they operate. And postmodernism and feminism have also been seen as two leading forces of our times, two leading movements, two leading conceptual frameworks which are also very definitive of these times. And the intellectual and the academic culture of the Western capitalist democracies, they also seem to reflect these two frameworks, they also seem to project these two frameworks in a more dominant fashion. And postmodernism and feminism, in that sense, they also share their certain affinities in their struggles against the grand narratives. And very important to note that these are not descriptive categories, but they are constitutive and evaluative terms. But this affinity that we locate between postmodernism and feminism is not as neat as it looks. There are also certain contradictions which are part of this. If we look at two positions adopted by Linda Hutcheon and Chris Wheaton, Linda Hutcheon notes that postmodernism has not theorized agency. It has no strategies of resistance that would correspond to feminist ones. There is no way in which the feminist and the postmodern can be conflated. And Chris Wheaton also reiterates, feminism is politics, postmodernism is not. It is certainly political, but it is politically ambivalent, double encoded as both complicity and critique, so that it can be and has been recuperated by both the left and the right, and each ignoring half of their double coding. So in what Linda Hutcheon and Chris Wheaton highlights, we can also see the contradictions which are in operation in these discussions related to feminism and postmodernism. And Patricia Waugh also illustrates the way in which some of the feminist theories also need to move away from the ideas such as the death of the author or the incredulity towards grand narratives. In her own words, they should not be surprised that so many women in the 70s articulated a desire to become authors of their own lives at precisely the moment that Barth was announcing the death of that concept. So here Patricia Waugh is also talking back to the ideas such as the death of the author, because it was also a way in which women who were just beginning to articulate themselves were forced to negate themselves because it was the wake of postmodernism. So there are these ways in which postmodernism and feminism, they seem to contradict each other and they seem not to share a certain kind of politics. And Nancy Hartstock also shares this same opinion when we talk about the shift towards subjectivity. And in 1990 she writes, why is it that just at the moment when so many of us who have been silenced begin to demand the right to name ourselves, to act as subjects rather than objects of history, that just then the concept of subjecthood becomes problematic. While postmodernism celebrates this moving away from history, the moving away from subjectivity, feminism finds precisely that problematic because their politics is also rooted very heavily, very predominantly on the idea of history. And a similar thing could be noted in the differences in the deconstructive impulses put forward by postmodernism and feminism. On the one hand, postmodern deconstructive theories, the deconstructive approaches can be seen as nihilistic, as they do not really resolve anything, and there is no way of knowing anything. It is a move away from epistemology towards the celebration of ontological existences. Feminism, on the other hand, it employs a more positive kind of deconstruction, because through the employment of deconstructive practices which are being used in certain texts, the feminist practices are able to denaturalize cultural practices and binary oppositions. And there is also a way in, and it is also imperative that these sort of deconstructive practices employed from the feminist perspective, they are grounded in the idea that women were and are oppressed. So, it is this sense of history which gives a positive impulse to the deconstruction which is being used from a feminist standpoint, and it is the move away from history, it is a move away from knowing, move away from identifying anything as truth or anything as knowledge that makes the postmodern deconstructive approach more nihilistic and more negative. And this also brings us to another important factor, that the feminist critics, the feminist conceptual framework also have, the feminist critiques and the feminist conceptual frameworks also have this need to believe in or acknowledge certain grand narratives, and also to acknowledge that there is a certain dominant consensus which is in practice, which is in place. And if we do not do that, it becomes impossible to challenge, subvert and reject those grand narratives which have also become the basis, become the foundation of various practices of suppression and oppression. While looking at the various ways in which the feminist theories may be posited in opposition to postmodern theories, it is important to look at Linda Hutcheon, who seems to have struck a balance, the right kind of a balance in understanding postmodernism in also in placing feminism and postmodernism together in the same framework during her literary critical practices. Linda Hutcheon is a Canadian academic, and she is also the author of a number of influential theories related to postmodernism. She also has the uncanny ability to place them within the broader debates of the contemporary. And some of her important works include a Postmodern Reader, a Poetics of Postmodernism, History, Theory and Fiction, the Canadian Postmodern, a Theory of Adaptation, Rethinking Literary History, and also a Theory of Parody. As a survey of her works would tell you, her work focuses on the idea of parody and also on the ways in which she employs postmodernism to analyze particular historical and narrative fiction. The feminist position that Linda Hutcheon adopts in connection with her work on postmodernism, it drew particular attention with respect to the ways in which she contradicted the idea of Jameson, the arguments of Jameson, which also predominantly argued that postmodernism suspends the base of any certainty such as history, subjectivity or reference, and also suspends all kinds of standard of judgment. And Jameson also lamented the lack of critical capabilities, as we have noticed in his work. And Hutcheon, on the other hand, highlights how postmodern modalities aid the process of critique rather than suspending them. So, here Linda Hutcheon uses a very efficient framework, a very efficient set of arguments to move against Jameson's position of arguing that postmodernism is eventually nothing but an offshoot of capitalist practices. Linda Hutcheon in that sense also takes us through this journey where she illustrates that postmodernism works through a parody, and how the element of parody helps postmodern texts to both legitimize and subvert that which it parodies. And she also shows through a discussion of a range of texts that postmodernism can rethink history. And for this, she particularly sets out to debunk the Marxist critiques of postmodernism. She argues against the dominant notions put forward by Marxist theorists such as Jameson and Terry Eagleton, who also hold the view that postmodern intertextuality merely reproduces the past in the form of a shallow and compromised nostalgia, rather than revealing its construction in discourse and ideology. They also showed through a series of illustrations how there is an impossibility in engaging with political critique when it comes to postmodern art, how it's all about shallowness and depthlessness, how there is an impossibility to talk about what lies behind the object of art. But Linda Hutcheon disputes this implication entirely, and she responds to Eagleton by way of an analysis of his own historical novel Saints and Scholars, published in 1987. And Eagleton's postmodern novel becomes more important in this context because he is a Marxist critic who has accused postmodern fiction of being ahistorical. And the irony of this situation is that Eagleton has written Saints and Scholars, which has then begun to be seen as one of the seminal postmodern texts, where we also see the paradox of postmodernism's use and abuse of history. And in this use of Terry Eagleton, we also find Linda Hutcheon taking a very interesting path, a very interesting literary, and by choosing to analyze Eagleton's Saints and Scholars to disprove the Marxist critiques of postmodernism, to debunk the Marxist critiques of postmodernism, Linda Hutcheon also emerges as a literary critical victor in this context. And if we look at the work Saints and Scholars by Terry Eagleton, it can be seen as a postmodern work of a Marxist critic, which is quite an oxymoron. And we also identify Saints and Scholars is seen as one of the typical postmodern texts for various reasons. We find a number of parodic intertextual echoes in the text, and there is also a sense of metafictional self-consciousness emerging. And in this work, we can see that the Eagleton successfully problematizes the distinction between the fictional and the real. For example, we have certain historical characters such as Connolly, Leopold Bloom and Ludwig Wittgenstein, and also Nikolai Bakhtin, who is apparently Mikhail Bakhtin's brother. Eagleton is basically offering us a new way of representing history, and this is not derived from the official account of the victors, but it is taken from the unofficial and from the usually unrecorded perspectives of victims of history. And this sort of an approach that he takes towards history, and this sort of an approach that he adopts in terms of his narratives, in terms of the textualizing process, it also seems to reconcile seemingly opposing positions. So, by using Saints and Scholars by Terry Eagleton to debunk the postmodernist myths, Linda Hutcheon is also drawing our attention to the fact that to collapse hierarchies is not to collapse distinctions. And this incidentally is also one of the major critiques from the Marxist perspective against postmodernism, that postmodernism is not attentive, it is not sensitive to the various forms of distinctions, which they also consider as not being very positive or not being very encouraging. And on the other hand, Linda Hutcheon, from a feminist perspective, she argues that the collapsing of the hierarchies need not mean the collapsing of distinctions, and in the same way, it is a pluralizing rhetoric of postmodernism that needs to be highlighted, otherwise it is entirely to miss the point of what postmodernism entails. And in her own work, she talks at length about the need to bring together the ideas of feminism and postmodernism in order to arrive at a more informed political critique. I read from her work, "Feminist practice in theory, criticism and art itself has posed new questions regarding the role of culture in the construction of patriarchy. It has addressed the tacit definitions of gender, class and culture that are operative and dominant at any given historical moment. It has joined with the postmodern in moving us away from the general universal truth to specific contextualized truths. It has forced us to see gender in relation to race, class, ethnicity and other forms of power relations, not in natural unchangeable power relations, but is constructed by particular social, economic and political forces. It has overlapped with our postmodern concern for exposing the relationships between meanings produced at the level of culture and meanings produced at other levels of the social formation. In other words, feminism and postmodernism have taught that and how we both make and make sense of our culture." So, this is a kind of a parallel that she draws between the feminist practices and also the postmodern conceptual frameworks. And in the context of her discussion of similar texts such as Terry Eagleton's Saints and Scholars, Hutcheon also uses this very interesting phrase which she herself had coined, historiographic metafiction. She uses this term historiographic metafiction to describe those literary texts that assert an interpretation of the past but are also intensely self-reflexive. And this kind of fiction, this kind of metafiction which uses history in a particular way, they are also critical of their own version of truth as being partial, biased and incomplete, and therein lies the self-reflexivity of the text. And this metafiction also has an advantage. It allows us to speak constructively about the past in a way that acknowledges the falsity and violence of the objective historian's past. So there is a possibility to engage with fiction, and there is also a very real possibility of offering a political critique. Here the use and abuse of history, as Hutcheon puts it, it comes into play in different forms in historiographic metafiction. There are certain works that she herself cites as examples of historiographic metafiction, such as John Fowles' The French Lieutenant's Woman, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, Thomas Pynchon's Mason and Dixon, and Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, and also A.S. Byatt's Possession. So all of these novels, they engage with the idea of history in a very playful way. They engage with the idea of history and also give an interpretation of the past, but from a very fictional, from a very self-reflexive, from a point of view that entirely challenges history, truth and all kinds of finality. So this term historiographic metafiction has been increasingly used to analyze and critically engage with the fiction produced during the postmodern age. It's also important to run you through some of the other important feminist interventions of this period, the most important one being Patricia Waugh's Feminine Fictions, published in 1989, and there is also the term coined by Alice Jardine, gynesis, in the context of her discussions in opposition to the gynocritics and how the new term could be used to talk about the postmodern feminist. But however, the term and the idea did not get much currency as she had hoped. And we have Mary Jacobus talking about not the sexuality of the text but the textuality of sex. And here we also find a lot of discussions relating to the body and about the need for writing the body in the context of postmodern feminist discussions. And Catherine Belsey spoke about juxtaposing the realist and the postmodern strategies for a more politically effective rendition, more politically effective articulation of history and of fiction, because she felt and argued that when you compare recognizable realist elements of fiction and also use them to challenge the conventions through disruptive strategies, there is a possibility for a more effective kind of political strategy to emerge. And she also used the term interrogative text to talk about this kind of fiction, which would use realist elements but also certain subversive and disruptive strategies. Craig Owens talked about feminism as an instance of postmodern thought, and we have Donna Haraway, who wrote the Manifesto for Cyborgs in 1985. So there are two moments which are particularly important in today's discussion for us. One is Patricia Waugh's Feminine Fictions and Donna Haraway's idea of the cyborgs. So we bookend our discussion of postmodern feminisms between Patricia Waugh and Donna Haraway. Patricia Waugh wrote this immensely popular and important influential work titled Feminine Fictions, Revisiting the Postmodern. In this, she attempted to cover the reasons why women writers have been largely excluded from the consideration of postmodern art. If we look at our own discussions, the ways in which we had been looking at the postmodern theories, the postmodern conceptual frameworks in the last couple of weeks, we have also noted this conspicuous absence of women from the entire discussion. The female writers, the female thinkers and theorists, they are foregrounded only when we particularly talk about feminism, when we particularly talk about gender. So with the exception of Julia Kristeva or Judith Butler or Helen Sixu, we do not have much of a discussion of women or women artists in the postmodern scenario. And Patricia Waugh also points out that the postmodern author is apparently represented through the universal use of the pronoun he. And this is very ironic and this is very disturbing, particularly because postmodern theories, they seem to argue against the meta-narratives. They seem to move away from all kinds of limiting descriptions and limiting frameworks, but at the same time it continues to be quite patriarchal, even when they move away from all those structures which support the grand narratives such as patriarchy. And Patricia Waugh in addition also talks about how she had been amazed at the number of general accounts of postmodernism which do not even mention gender. And this conspicuous absence cannot be overlooked, it cannot be considered as an oversight, because it's also one of the ways in which postmodernism defines itself. Postmodernism frames itself by moving away from all grand narratives and all kinds of limiting frameworks and binaries. While this sort of an absence remains central to the discussions of feminism and postmodernism, it's also an important thing that we need to come back and engage with. It's equally important to take a look at Donna Haraway's work on cyborgs, which also challenges the newer possibilities of engaging with feminism and postmodernism in a more systematic fashion. Donna Haraway's work acquires a lot of significance in a culture of high technology where the boundaries are no longer clear. She talks about how the distinction between a human and animal, animal and machine, or human and a machine are increasingly getting blurred in this age of in this age of information technology. And she also particularly talks about the figure of cyborg to talk about a new kind of feminism which is available to us. And cyborg is a figure without boundaries. It is both human and machine. It's also used as a metaphor by Haraway to talk about the socialist feminist theoretical interventions. And in that sense, Haraway is also arguing, she's also illustrating through the use of cyborgs that it may help feminist theorists imagine a world that is not seen in or confined to hierarchical dualisms. So by imagining a new kind of figure such as that of a cyborg, which challenges boundaries and distinctions, it's also giving a leeway to the postmodern feminist movement. Because cyborg resists and eludes final definitions in various ways, and this should be Haraway argues is like feminist theory, the intention of which is to also avoid totalizing the category of woman. And Donna Haraway is particularly noted for two of her works, Simian, Cyborgs and Women, the Reinvention of Nature, and also her essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, which was published in 1985. The book was in 1984. So these two important works also could be seen as a major intervention in locating the need for feminism, in locating how feminism operates in this age of cyborgs, in this digital age of technology. Caught between these opposing positions that Patricia Waugh and Donna Haraway holds, it's also important to look at some of the newer articulations from the feminist standpoint. This interesting work, Sara Ahmed's Differences That Matter, Feminist Theory and Postmodernism, published in 1998, deserves a special mention. In this interesting work, Sara Ahmed talks about the need to challenge the existing ways of theorizing the relationship between feminism and postmodernism, because there are certain limited ways, there are certain conventional, predictable ways in which the relationship between feminism and postmodernism gets located. And postmodernism, Sara Ahmed argues, has been allowed to dictate certain feminist debates, and she also argues that instead of this, feminism must be allowed to ask questions of postmodernism. And she feels that the way ahead, the way to go forward is also by asking these sort of questions and speaking back to postmodernism from a predominantly feminist standpoint. And this speaking back entails a refusal to position postmodernism as a generalizing condition of the world, and it also requires a closer reading of what postmodernism is actually doing. And in that sense, one of the things that she proposes is to examine the construction of postmodernism in relation to rights, ethics, subjectivity, authorship, metafiction and film. So here, instead of postmodernism inquiring into how feminism functions, here is Sara Ahmed arguing for the need to examine with the feminist tools how postmodernism works and what postmodernism is actually doing. So it's important to locate the ambivalences in these different discussions. It's important to see the different political positions that these discussions in the context of feminism and postmodernism adopts, and it's all the more important to understand how these differences, these distinctions and these opposing ideas are also inherent to our understanding of postmodernism in literature. In this brief outline that we have given about feminism and postmodernism, you would have also figured out that postmodernism begins to make sense not as isolated kinds of theories and concepts and frameworks, but it begins to make sense only when it is in dialogue, when it is in constant dialogue with other movements such as Marxism and feminism. And it's also important to see how postmodernism begins to respond to these other challenges which are being posited from the Marxist or from the feminist framework. So in that connection, in the following session, we shall also be taking a look at how the moment of the post-colonial also informs the understanding of the postmodernism, how it also places certain new demands of postmodernism, which would radically change the conceptions, which would also radically alter some of the definitions that are currently in place. So with this, we begin to wind up today's lecture. And in the next session, we shall be taking a look at how the post-colonial moment intervenes and how it redefines the idea of the postmodern. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.